Hello, I'm Russell Michaels. Thank you for joining me and welcome to Cine Politics, where we discuss the social and, of course, as always, the political issues which have inspired all kinds of films and documentaries from all around the world. And on today's programme, we're discussing the new documentary, Capitalism Is The Crisis, Radical Politics in the Age of Austerity, directed by Michael Trusello. His film mixes academic analysis of the global financial crisis with the increasingly angry and desperate protests across Europe and America. What started with the US mortgage crisis has rapidly expanded into a crisis for the global banking system, and governments are now falling too. So is capitalism in crisis or the cause of the crisis which is engulfing it? And are austerity measures, which are gutting public services and workers' rights, actually a weapon aimed at the middle and working classes, making them pay for the mistakes of the financial elites? Alarming footage from Greece, Toronto, Spain, and Wisconsin seems to reveal a fast-growing war of ideologies. But if the old system is failing, can we replace it with something better?
Our most urgent task upon taking office was to shore up the same banks that helped cause this crisis. It was not easy to do. And if there's one thing that has unified Democrats and Republicans, and everybody in between, it's that we all hated the bank bailout. I hated it. I hated it. I hated it. You hated it. It was about as popular as a root canal.
Yes, it's a big challenge because what we've seen in the whole way capitalism operates, again, over this neoliberal period of the last 30 years, that is to say, the period of just throwing everything into the market and cutting back everything else, what we've seen is that more and more social wealth is going into banking and financial institutions. They've become sort of the central operators and organizers of how the capitalist market economy works, and they've been siphoning off more and more wealth. And in the process, what that's meant is that financial institutions have come to exercise huge power over workers in a variety of ways. Either directly, we become more and more indebted through mortgage structures, credit cards, other kinds of borrowing that keep us noses to the grindstone trying to pay the bills. But also, these financial institutions are often dominating large corporations, dictating their investment decisions, what factories close, which ones get new investment. And of course, what they basically do is they go for the low-wage areas, the ones with the highest profits, the ones that are taming workers, keeping them under control. And so that is an enormous challenge.
So, with Greece bracing itself for more crippling austerity measures and other nations fearing the same, what is the verdict on capitalism itself? Well, here to discuss Capitalism Is The Crisis are my guests, Simon Dixon, author of Bank to the Future, and we have Mike McCahill, film critic for the Sunday Telegraph. Very warm welcome to the programme to both of you. And to start with you, Mike, is this film really an us versus them kind of story or analysis, or is it saying something more complex?
Well, I mean, us versus them is the idea the film is trying to sell us on. It's an activist text. It's trying to get us riled up enough to want to go out onto the streets and protest. And I think the interviewees have been chosen because they're broadly in agreement with the thesis of both the film and the filmmaker. It is one of those films where as soon as you've seen or heard the title, you kind of know what it's going to be saying for an hour and 40 minutes. And what's missing would be any insider figures, for example. I mean, people who've worked within the capitalist system and have seen at first hand how the system both works and doesn't work. And there was a documentary, The Corporation, which came out 10 years or so ago now, which I think is one of the great documentaries of the 21st century, and was much better integrated in terms of getting figures from both the left and the right. Whereas this, I think, is a film that is mostly all us and no them.
Okay, well, if it is about them, who is the them? Do you agree with the title, first of all, Simon, that capitalism is the crisis, and neoliberalism is the word that keeps being thrown at us? Who is the them behind that?
Yeah, well, as a business person and an ex-investment banker, you can imagine I don't agree with the title. If the title was more banking is the crisis or corporatism is the crisis, then I'd tend to agree. But the documentary makes a classic mistake, which many people make, which is confusing a broken and corrupt banking system with capitalism in general.
What do you think the film should be telling us about capitalism in general, or the system that people don't really understand? What do you think people are missing?
Well, that separation between what's happened with the banking system, the way that banking is actually engineered to fail and collapse, and the troubles with banking, and then separating that from the business person out there that's out to make an honest buck, and also the large corporate company, big public companies, which are a side effect of the banking system. All three very different topics, which were kind of mumbled into one.
Okay, so it's slightly messy, you feel. Well, Mike, is it that you've said that he wants us to protest? Is the film a call to action at heart? And people are already on the streets. There's the Occupy movement. What does the film want us to do?
Well, its argument is that just as capitalism has mutated into, whether you want to call it postmodern capitalism, corporate capitalism, so too radical politics needs to adapt to address that situation. And its preferred mutation, if you like, is this form of direct action. So people getting out, striking, staging rallies, joining unions. It brings up the Occupy Wall Street movement, and a similar thing we see over here with the UK and cuts movement, which is targeting those UK firms that are judged to have defaulted on tax payments.
Briefly, Simon, if you think that you say the banking system is corrupt, can you briefly say why you think that?
Well, yeah, the banking system is just operating within the framework in which it's allowed to operate, and the government allow the banking system to create virtually all money, and that's a major problem which is not often looked at by economists, and the root of much of the troubles that we're having today.
Okay, well, let's pause there and see a clip where austerity measures have ignited outrage and public protests all across Europe.
Simple definition is governments have budgets, and they have revenues, and they have expenditures, and if the expenditures exceed the revenues, they run off deficits, and a series of more than 1 year of deficit runs into debt. The question is, where did it come from, and what would you do about it? Austerity is a right-wing view of what to do about these deficits and debts. So what it means to them is to cut, essentially, spending on social welfare programs. There are many other things that you could do. There are many things you could do better to get rid of the debt, the deficit, but they've chosen to do it because it's part of class warfare. In fact, in Canada, StatsCan did a study years ago of where the debt came from, that the 95 Liberals got into power and fought that debt, and they concluded that 94% of the debt did not come from spending on welfare programs. 50% of it came from tax cuts, and 44% came from high interest rates.
A day of protests in Europe, countries that are members of the European Union, home to 500 million people. The unions there are hosting strikes and protests against their government's handling of the economy. In Barcelona, violence broke out as protesters supporting the general strike against the government spending cuts hurled objects and barriers at riot police. They also burned a police vehicle in the center of the city. El Mundo newspaper reports, though, that demonstrators involved in the clashes were not union members, but part of an anti-establishment group also protesting the government's belt-tightening measures. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of people marched through Brussels. The unions across the EU say the government's measures will slow economic recovery and punish the poor. Marchers representing 50 unions that include German coal miners, Romanian gas workers, and Polish shipbuilders headed for the EU's headquarters, waving union flags and carrying banners. Trade unions said they had called rallies in 13 capitals from Lisbon to Helsinki.
Simon, in terms of Greece, which is going to be feeling more austerity measures, of course, is the solution really one for the Greek people or for the financial elites that are saying, well, we'll get as much out of this as we can and benefit from the austerity measures?
Yeah, everything we're seeing right now, not just in Greece, it's in every country, is trying to solve debt with more debt. And obviously, whoever's issuing that debt is the person or the institution that's gonna benefit from that.
Is that the European Central Bank or the IMF?
It's the banking system being propped up by a central bank as well.
There's a quote in the film at the very beginning from Warren Buffett, the billionaire industrialist. He says, "It's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning." And in that clip, we see an academic saying it's class warfare. Do you agree with that analysis of it?
Well, there's no doubt the system that we operate in today is making the biggest divide between the rich and the poor. There's no doubt you just got to look at the statistics to actually see that. And that is making a big class warfare, as it were, a big division between the haves and the haves-not. And that is the challenge that I have with this film, is that it blames that on capitalism, whereas capitalism is a way for the small person today to create the business and get out of it.
So it could be the solution as well as the problem. So Mike, to bring you in here, do you agree with the class warfare side of this? Do you think it's a right-wing policy to increase inequality on purpose?
Well, one of the interesting aspects of the film gets into is this whole idea that austerity is another one of the brands that's been sold to us over the years, that it is that we're supposed to buy this, we're supposed to hunker down and cut back and allow other people to cut away at us for the common good. And dial down our expectation generally while we wait for the authorities, the powers that be who got us into this mess to then clear it up. In the meantime, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of let-up in the stories about executive pay, bankers' bonuses, and the powers that be are now more equipped than ever to send down a baton charge whenever these waves of dissent rise up. Yeah. It seems to be, business as usual, if not on the high street, then certainly within the power structures that we're negotiating every day of our lives.
And talking about protest and free speech, technocrats have been installed instead of governments now in some places, Greece particularly, obviously. Do you think this is a crisis for democracy as well, Simon?
Is it a crisis for democracy? Well, that's definitely being put into question right now. There's no doubt that what we're seeing right now is a massive shift in power, which is definitely breaching upon the democracy of what's happening right now. And that's all through the refinancing of debt and whoever's controlling the purse strings.
If you just briefly mention the Prime Minister of the technocrat Prime Minister of Greece, he was a former Vice President of the European Central Bank. Who is he representing? If not the people, who is he representing?
Well, there's no doubt that the central banks are representing the interests of the banks right now. It's the government are completely scared that they don't have the relevant expertise, and the banks are using their expertise to fear the government into making certain decisions.
Okay, well, let's pause there and see a clip where the voices of students from Canada to London express their loss of faith in the system.
Hi everyone, so my name is Leanna Salvador and I am just an ordinary student. I have $50,000 in student loans and I am just an ordinary student. I am just an ordinary racialized woman, and by the time I have paid the interest on my student loans, I will have paid twice as much for the same education as someone who could pay in full up front. And when the face of poverty is dominated by women and racialized people, education can and should be a social equalizer. I am just an ordinary student whose parents always told me that knowledge is power. But what my government tells me is that knowledge is just plain expensive. Is this the kind of world we want to live in? Where only the rich deserve to learn? I'm just an ordinary student who's left to wonder where education fits within a system that values only commodities that can be bought or sold in a marketplace.
These are my people and this is our nation. Too many people have died in fed stations.
This was meant to be the first post-ideological generation, right? This was meant to be the generation that never thought of anything bigger than our Facebook profiles and our TV screens. This was meant to be the generation where the only thing that Saturday night meant was X Factor. I think now that claim is quite ridiculous. I think now that claim is quite preposterous. I think now we've shown that we are as ideological as ever before. Now we've shown that solidarity and comradeship and all those things that used to be associated with students are as relevant now as they've ever been.
Mike, the kind of attacks by the state on people, particularly students, there's an incredible amount of young people who've rallied to the cause and express their voices and opinions. Is this an attack on civil rights and democratic rights, do you think?
Well, I mean, we saw in the clip there, I mean, there's a fair bit of evidence to suggest the police were, at the very least, heavy-handed in treating, in responding to what were ostensibly peaceful protests. I mean, the G20 Summit in Toronto, for example, recently,
yes.
There were secret laws brought in to prosecute protesters. There were ad hoc jails thrown up to throw protesters in custody, and as in many of the G20 cities around the world, this vast ring of steel was constructed around the central zone. Now, it seems to me that we've arrived at a point in time where vast amounts of public money are being spent on keeping the public out of the debate, the democratic process.
I think it was $858 million in Canada was spent on security. Yeah. Extraordinary.
And where
figure.
do we get that money at this time? In the time frame.
That money must have come from the public purse to some degree.
Yeah.
Simon, the U.S. housing crisis mutating to a global bank crisis, mutating to a government debt crisis. Do you agree with this film's analysis of that process? And what is the next phase, in your opinion?
I do agree. I thought it was very well put, that process of how we're moving towards. I talked about that there's 5 different things that could actually happen. Either we're going to have a banking crisis again, that's due next because we've done nothing to solve that. Right. Or the government, when they try and bail out the banks to prevent a banking crisis, they're going to have their own crisis and governments going bust, and we're going to see more of that everywhere. We're going to, in order to save that, we're going to move towards higher and higher levels of tax. And so that's where we're moving in that direction. Or what we're opting for at the moment is central banks bailing everything out and taking up a lot of the assets. What I talk about where we need to move towards is we need to look at some real reform of the way banking actually operates, and the only way we're going to get there is through riots.
Really? So you think it's a public protest issue that it can only be solved that way?
The governments will only do what the public will ask them to do en masse.
Well, in terms of the students we saw in the clip there, Mike, is part of the kind of nub of this that, all right, so I need a loan to have an education, but that someone's making a profit out of that loan? Interest.
One of the interviewees describes we've now arrived at a point in time where the system is turning scholars into serfs. So you can see why the students are angry. I mean, the students are a group that distinguish themselves in this film. I think one of the flaws with the film is that we don't get enough of a sense of what the other protesters say. I mean, there are a lot of people that are very angry right now, and the speakers that we see tend to merge into this one amorphous collective voice of dissent, where I think that there are several groups who are rightfully angry, the students being one of them.
Very briefly, do you think that banks and the governments have underestimated the young?
Well, I mean, those are the young are our canaries in the coal mine. They're the people who get hit first and often hardest with the tuition fees and the student loans.
Thank you. Well, let's see our last clip, where Professor David McNally from York University highlights Bolivia's approach to the challenges ahead.
It's so interesting that one of the new terms that's emerging in a lot of the grassroots movements, for example, in Bolivia today, where they've got the first indigenous president in the history of the country, the movement for socialism forms the government party, and so on, is eco-socialism. They're talking about a new variation of socialism where environmentalism and ecological sustainability is a core value, a fundamental building block of it. So I think you're right to highlight that. I don't see that it's helpful at all to sort of urge on the great collapse. I think there's too much human suffering associated and too much environmental damage associated with that. I think it's much more important to begin to build actual alternatives that we can then point to. Here are the beginning ways of thinking about reorganizing society.
Simon, is the word capitalism, the idea capitalism, is it a kind of 20th century thing? It was different then, now it's mutated into sort of super capitalism. Is it outdated in the 21st century? And what new solutions could come in to kind of counter it or make it better?
Well, ironically, capitalism is probably the only system that's going to produce any kind of solution, any kind of alternative. The only reason this film documentary existed is because they were able to make it in capitalism. So what's coming out now is we're emerging lots of different systems, lots of alternative systems. Capitalism is producing systems that don't involve money. We're having time banking. One of the adventures that I'm working on is Bank to the Future, which is aimed at getting as much money to social entrepreneurs and people that are looking to make a really big difference through capitalism.
And small towns in America and other places are printing their own money to control their own local economy. Do you think that's the way to go?
Yeah, localized currencies. You can set up your own little economy. By now, it doesn't even necessarily need to be geography. People are setting up their own little economies in Facebook based upon what they're interested in. So, and that was a system that came from capitalism.
Okay, so capitalism could be the solution as well as the problem. So, Mike, what the director says on his website, replace capitalism. What with? What does he give us, and what do you take from the film in that way?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not entirely certain the film knows either. I mean, going back to Bolivia, which was the clip that we saw there, I mean, it wouldn't be the first North American film to have this slightly skewed romantic idea of South America as this hotbed of passionate dissent and resistance, the place of Che and Fidel. But that particular model may only work within a fairly compact agriculture-based economy. It may not necessarily be exportable, and certainly not exportable to larger, more complex economies. I think it's important to try and explore these alternatives, to give airtime to these alternatives, and to try and keep an open mind, if only because the previous system had proved so adept at sort of putting the shutters down on us.
And Simon, you made some predictions. Do you think that they're going to lead to kind of increasing inequality gap that we've never seen before? I mean, if you've got countries falling, where traffic lights are not being mended and schools are not being paid for, what kind of future do you see very quickly coming upon us?
Yeah, inequality is only going in one direction, and it will continue to move in that direction as long as we operate under the system that we're currently operating on. There's no way of turning it around. It can't turn around. Unemployment's not turning around. It's only going in one direction.
You withdrew from the financial industry on moral grounds, you've said. What do you think the moral issues are compared to the purely economic solutions? How do you rate those two together?
Yeah, well, for me, I got fed up. When I worked in an investment bank, I got fed up with using capitalism to create no value. There's a difference between the speculative economy, no value, and the productive economy, which is where I spend my time in capitalism now.
And Mike, in the film, there's a lot of anger on the streets. Obviously, the filmmaker's pretty angry. How do we evaluate that in terms of what understanding we need in terms of improving the situation because we understand it, not just because we're angry at it?
Well, I mean, it does call for what it describes as the right kind of resistance, which is to get beyond this idea of gestural resistance, throwing rubbish bins through the window of Starbucks, kicking banks' front doors in, things like that. I mean, I think what it's trying to do is to try and overturn this sort of rather gloomy preconception that some of us may have that, it's all gone horribly wrong and there's no recovery. I mean, the film reminds us that the world is still ours, the future is still up for grabs, and we need to get out there and rethink and reshape our world because it's in a pretty bad state right now.
Well, that's a positive thought, that there's a possibility it can get better. So a warm thank you to my guests, Simon Dixon and Mike McCahill, and also thank you, and please do join us again at the same time next week. But in the meantime, as usual, we'd love to hear your views too, so please do email us at the address on the screen, cinepolitics@presstv.co.uk, and also, why not, click on our Facebook fan page and join us there and debate with your questions or suggestions for any future films that we could discuss here. But for now, goodbye.